In this video, we're going to be taking a look at fiscal policy. We'll start off by looking at how we can define fiscal policy, and then we'll see how it can be used to affect aggregate demand in the economy to then achieve government objectives. We'll then look at the meaning of a balanced budget and explain some of the consequences of operating a budget surplus and a budget deficit. Briefly summed up, the job of the state or the government on an economic level is to monitor the economy and ensure a good balance between macroeconomic objectives. The government wishes to, for example, boost economic growth and increase real GDP. Through this, it hopes to bring about prosperity. This is just one of the government's macroeconomic objectives, and there are many more. One set of policies to achieve these objectives is fiscal policy. Fiscal policy can be defined as the use of policy instruments such as government spending, taxation, and government borrowing to affect the level of aggregate demand in the economy to achieve macroeconomic objectives. A large part of this video now is going to be about dissecting this definition, ensuring that we know what fiscal policy is, how it works, and what its effects are. Firstly, let's look at government spending. Government spending encompasses a wide range of things, but they can be roughly broken down into three groups: current spending, capital spending, and transfer payments. Current spending involves the day-to-day expenditure of governments and the public sector in general to provide public goods. This could include paying teachers' salaries or ensuring that hospitals are well equipped to treat patients. Capital spending, on the other hand, refers to payments for durable goods, in other words, capital, that will benefit the economy over time and mostly in the longer term. This could include infrastructure, for example. Examples of capital spending include the HS2 rail project, a high-speed train line from London to Manchester. And lastly, government spending includes transfer payments. This provides a social safety net, if you will, redistributing income from the rich to the poor through initiatives such as food stamps or unemployment benefits. You may ask yourself, from where does the government get the money it spends? The answer to this is that there are two primary sources of government revenue: taxation and borrowing. Of these, taxation is the dominant source. This diagram here is a summary of the UK government's budgetary position in 2017. Government spending is shown in pink, and government revenue from taxation is shown in grey. Government borrowing is shown in blue. Outgoings, or government spending, totalling £809 billion, were financed largely through taxation, which was at around £769 billion. £40 billion of borrowing was used to make up the difference. Like monetary policy, fiscal policy is a demand-side policy, and this means that changes in fiscal policy affect aggregate demand in the economy. Governments can then use this to achieve macroeconomic objectives. But what is aggregate demand? Well, aggregate demand can be defined with this equation. Aggregate demand is consumer spending plus business investment plus government spending plus net exports. Changes in any one of these factors will impact aggregate demand, and this is precisely what fiscal policy does. It affects either consumer spending, business investment, government spending, or net exports in order to change aggregate demand, and governments use this to stimulate economic growth, for example, or to lower unemployment levels. We can also abbreviate this equation to the one noted below. AD is equal to C plus I plus G plus X minus M. X minus M refers to net exports because X refers to exports and M refers to imports. Exports minus imports equals net exports. So there are two main types of fiscal policy: the type of fiscal policy that increases aggregate demand and that which reduces aggregate demand. This first type, expansionary fiscal policy, as the name suggests, looks to using policy instruments, so government spending or taxation, to increase aggregate demand in the economy with the aim of expanding the economy. That's why it's called expansionary fiscal policy. We can show an increase in aggregate demand using a macroeconomic diagram. This is very similar to a microeconomic diagram with demand and supply. It's just that here we have aggregate demand and aggregate supply, and the aggregate supply curve is shaped slightly differently. But what is it exactly that leads to an increase in aggregate demand, leading the AD curve to shift outwards? Well, for that we can go back to our equation. AD is equal to C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Let's see how we can use government spending, or rather alter government spending, to increase aggregate demand. Note that one of the terms here in aggregate demand is government spending. So if we simply increase government spending, we can increase aggregate demand. We could maybe do this by hiring more teachers to reduce class sizes. That would be a way of increasing aggregate demand, because the government has hired more teachers. They now need to pay those teachers' salaries, meaning that government spending will have increased. How will reducing taxation lead to an increase in aggregate demand? For this, we can look to the C and the I portions of aggregate demand. When governments cut taxes, this is expansionary because it gives people more disposable income to spend in the real economy, for example in local shops. This is because individuals get to keep a greater share of their incomes. Therefore, reducing taxation can lead to an increase in consumer spending. But what about business investment? Well, if governments cut corporation tax, which is a tax on company profits, this can affect the I part of AD, because it allows firms to keep more of their profits to give them more funds to invest in research and development and the expansion of product lines. This is why expansionary fiscal policy, through reducing taxation, could lead to an increase in business investment. So we can see here how increasing government spending or reducing taxation can affect C, I, and G, and all of these will lead to an increase in aggregate demand. Conversely, contractionary fiscal policy refers to using government spending or taxation to reduce aggregate demand. This can have a contractionary effect on the economy. Again, we can use the AD equation to see why this is the case. If we reduce government spending, then it's pretty self-explanatory. That will lead to a fall in government spending here, causing AD to reduce. Increasing taxation on consumers, for example through increasing VAT, or increasing corporation tax to increase taxes on business profits, will lead to a fall in consumer spending, because consumers have less disposable income, and a fall in business investment, because firms have less money available to invest. All in all, using these policies to either reduce government spending or increase taxation will likely cause aggregate demand to fall, causing a shift in the aggregate demand curve inwards. Just a quick note on infrastructure. Government investment in infrastructure is interesting because it's classed as both a fiscal and a supply side policy. It just depends on whether you're looking at it in the short term or the long term. In the short term, government investment in infrastructure is fiscal policy because it leads to an increase in aggregate demand, simply because G will increase. However, in the longer term, infrastructure projects are supply side policies. This is because when this infrastructure is operational, for example when HS2 is fully opened, this increases the productive potential of the economy. If you'd like to learn more about supply side policy, I have a video on that as well on this channel. Let's now look at some of the benefits and drawbacks of fiscal policy. Firstly, fiscal policy is versatile. It can be used to solve a wide range of economic and social issues. For example, it can be used to reduce unemployment levels as a whole across the country through broad-based stimulus measures such as the furlough scheme that's currently being used amid the coronavirus crisis. But it can also be used to revitalize specific areas, such as through monetary incentives for businesses to set up in town centers of left-behind, underperforming regions. In that sense, it's a very useful policy for governments. Another key benefit is what's known as the multiplier effect. This means that government spending often has a larger effect on the economy and on GDP than the original amount spent. This is an idea attributed to John Maynard Keynes, a British economist, arguably one of the most renowned economists of all time. His idea was that when a government injects money into the economy, the overall increase in GDP as a result of that is greater than the original injection. And let's see why this is the case with an example. Say that the government puts £100 into the economy to build HS2. Really, that value is £106 billion, but let's stick with smaller numbers. Where does that money actually go? Well, it goes to construction workers, architects, electricians, and many other people. But what do these people do with the salaries they have now earned? Well, they will most likely go and spend that money in the domestic economy, in supermarkets or local cafes, for example. GDP is a measure of the value of all goods and services produced in a country in a given period of time, for example, a year. What's interesting here is the money earned by the workers involved in HS2 for their work in producing the railway lines is also earned at all the supermarkets and cafes and other businesses where those people spend their money. This leads to the initial fiscal injection to spur higher orders of economic growth, simply because this money is being spent along in return for goods and services being produced. This is why the effect of initial fiscal injections into the economy is often larger. Hence, the multiplier effect. This shows that fiscal policy can be very effective in stimulating an economy, especially during a recession, and this is one of the central tenets of Keynesianism. There are, however, disadvantages. Firstly, fiscal policy can be inflationary. The increased aggregate demand caused by government spending could cause the general price level to increase. This is covered in my inflation video. Another issue with fiscal policy is the debt repayments. If governments consistently have to borrow money to fund spending, that is, they consistently run budget deficits, which we'll cover on in a little bit, then this will lead to a compounding of these budget deficits over time, increasing the size of the national debt. Interest payments obviously have to be paid on this debt, meaning that as the national debt increases, more and more tax revenues that would ordinarily go to other causes to provide public goods have to be redirected to pay these debt interest payments. This could be seen as wasteful and certainly avoidable if the debt was reduced. This is one reason why the UK followed a policy of austerity after the 2008 financial crisis. Here are a few more definitions. Firstly, a budget surplus is when tax revenues exceed government spending. The opposite of that is a budget deficit. That's when government spending exceeds tax revenues. A balanced budget, on the other hand, is when government spending is equal to tax revenues. However, a slight tolerance either way, usually around 3% of GDP, is accepted in this definition. There are arguments for and against running budget surpluses and budget deficits. Firstly, budget surpluses may not be desirable because they lead to less investment in public goods. If government spending is constrained by tax revenue, because budget surpluses mean that the government is spending less than it takes in through taxation, then this means that the government may have to cut back and not provide some services such as public libraries, which may have a negative impact on communities which do rely on these services. Budget surpluses could also be bad for productivity. If the government isn't spending as much as it normally would if it was running a budget deficit, for instance, then it may not be able to afford the kinds of infrastructure projects and fiscal injections that could be used to increase productivity growth and improve the productive potential of the economy in general. One specific example of this relating to labour productivity is that if a government runs a budget surplus and therefore may not be able to afford training schemes to improve the human capital of the workforce, then this could lead to a fall in labour productivity, because it means that workers who may have wanted to retrain, to reskill, to become more productive can no longer do so because the government isn't able to provide the funds for that training. However, one benefit of budget surpluses is that by conserving funds and not having to borrow every year, governments may be better prepared for future unseen economic shocks such as the coronavirus crisis. It may be desirable for the government to save money during times when the future economic outlook is good in order to have the funds ready to provide such unprecedented fiscal stimulus should the need arise. Looking on the other side of the coin, there are advantages and disadvantages to budget deficits as well. As I've explained, one of the reasons why we may not want a budget deficit is the debt and the debt interest that governments get involved in. As I explained in the previous slide, budget deficits are when government spending exceeds government revenue, and so budget deficits are often associated with consistent expansionary fiscal policy. One disadvantage of expansionary fiscal policy is that it can be inflationary, and so this is also a disadvantage of having consistent budget deficits. However, a benefit of running budget deficits is that if they lead to a larger, more prominent public sector through higher government spending, then this could be good for unemployment. Some economists are calling for a jobs guarantee, and although this could lead to higher and higher budget deficits, this could lead to lower unemployment levels. Here's a news article relating to this topic. As usual, you can read this article and then answer the questions and the extension below. Thank you very much for listening.